Hi, welcome back. This is part two of the Genesis videos. I kind of ran out of time in terms of Genesis 1 through 3, so I'll wrap that up here and then we'll skip to Genesis 12. And then I'll also take a look at the chapter 3 PowerPoint just to review the information that you would need for the book of Genesis. Okay, so let's head right on back to Genesis 1 through 3. So in chapter 2, this is when source J begins his creation story. So chapter 1 was source P, which is one particular priestly source that wrote that creation story. And then chapters 2 to 3 of Genesis is actually source J, who preferred the name Yahweh or Jehovah for God. This one, source J, is a very different style of source. Characters are named, there's conversations, there are personalities for the people involved. In fact, God is seen in very kind of anthropomorphic ways, like in human terms, where he is walking upon the earth, or he smells something, or he forms something. So you get the impression that he's like a kind of a human form type of person, as opposed to chapter 1, where it's just bing, 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 and they create things. Like I said in this chapter, God created man first, named him Adam. He told him, "Don't eat of any tree of the don't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but you can eat of any other tree," which frankly included the tree of life. And then he tried to make him a partner from the various animals, but Adam didn't like it, so then he created Eve. Um, they both seem to have an understanding that they should not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But the serpent comes along, says, "Hey, no, you're not going to die. You're just going to know good and evil." Both of them eat of the tree. They both know good and evil. The serpent is right. God is wrong. And but regardless, God punishes them, all of them, man, woman, and the serpent. The man by now having to work to get things out of the soil. The woman will now have pain in childbearing, and then the serpent has to crawl on its belly. They are then, so read that story pretty carefully, okay? Then he says, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. I don't want him to take from the tree of life too and live forever, because they really would be godlike." So he kicks them out of the garden, but he does make sure that he has garments of skin for the man and his wife and clothe them. So even though one of the main themes of Genesis, and actually, frankly, of the whole Bible, is kind of our human stupidity, we're constantly breaking the rules that God lays out for us, God always forgives us. Even though God is punishing, God always forgives us and never abandons us. Even though it may seem like it, God really fundamentally doesn't abandon us, because we are, in fact, God's greatest creation. Okay, according to the Bible. Okay, so as we progress through these stories, let me go take a look at the PowerPoint here. In the PowerPoint, you will see there's the differences between the two creation stories. Chapter 1 is from source P, chapter 2 to 3 is from source J. This is the description of how things were created here. Genesis 2, there is no order. Okay. Hauer also outlines that that there are these four sources, and I say go look at page 53 for this, because it's a good discussion describing the four different sources of the Old Testament, and that they're all like groups of people. It's not just individuals writing this stuff, and that is what's called the documentary source hypothesis, that there are in fact four different sources for the authors. Okay. There's descriptions of what these sources are like. I will leave you to it to understand what these particular sources were like. He also talks about how in the ancient Near East, remember, the people of the Bible were not like a static group of people who lived all by themselves. They were a group of people amongst many different groups of people that all had their own stories and pantheons of gods and things like that. And in fact, the people of the Bible were the only monotheistic people of that ancient Near East. Most of the other cultures around there had pantheons of gods, or were polytheistic with many different gods. And some of that polytheism is hinted at in the Bible. The biblical editors do everything they can to kind of remove any notion of other gods, to the point where they're like, you shall have no other gods above me in the Ten Commandments. But the fact that they have to say, don't have any other gods above me, implies or has the understanding that they in fact were probably worshiping other gods. The fact that they have to set that rule down means they probably were. Anyway, because they're living in a culture where it's all these stories and ideas are being mixed about, that's why Howard talks about the Babylonian Enuma Elish myth and the Atrahasis epic, both of which have very similar ideas of how creation begins, except in a kind of a different cosmic pantheon polytheistic way. So in the same way that I had described in the first video, the dome of water above and below, in the Babylonian Enuma Elish myth, Marduk kills Tiamat, a dragon of watery chaos, and divides her body to form a dome of water from above and below. So the themes and the kind of order of creation are very similar. It's just like from another culture, but we can see that the creation myths didn't come out of a vacuum. They came out of a whole plethora of different ideas that were bouncing about. Okay? So in Genesis 3 to 11, you will notice that I kind of focused a lot on Genesis 1 and then 2 and 3. After that, I'm assuming you're going to read it. All of the other stories are really about, and this is the theme of Genesis 3 to 11, the idea that we keep failing God. You know, God keeps taking care of us and saying, please don't do this. And then we keep kind of abusing this relationship. But that the fact that God always comes back. So there's a tension between harmony in creation and alienation, because we keep fighting back and keep breaking the rules. But God keeps with us, constantly stays with us, even though we're really not worthy of being in contract with. Do you know what I mean? So in the Cain and Abel story, the two sons of Adam and Eve both make offerings to God, but for some reason he likes Abel's offering and not Cain's. No explanation given. So Cain kills Abel, but even then, even when committing the most egregious sin of murder of your own sibling, God still protects Cain by giving him a mark and making sure that even though he is exiled, he will be protected. So it's kind of an interesting dilemma of God punishing for murder, but not really killing Cain as a result, protecting Cain, because he still is creation, Then the flood comes, where people have just been acting so egregiously that God just decides to wipe out all of civilization. But once again, not everyone. Noah is found to be righteous, and he and his family are saved on the ark. That is actually very similar to a Babylonian story called the Epic of Gilgamesh, where there is a person who is also saved on an ark and allowed to take his family to the ends of the world. His name is Utnapishtim, and he has a conversation with Gilgamesh, the hero of that epic, about how that happened. So there's a flood story in Babylonian mythology. There's a flood story in biblical mythology. At the end of the flood story, Noah survives but gets drunk. You notice that? And so it's really like, we're really never perfect. Even the one guy that's worth saving in the flood story gets trashed immediately after getting off his ship. So, here we go. And then, of course, chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel, that's when humanity tries to build a tower to be close to God, and as a punishment, God disperses them or causes them to babble, and gives them many different languages. So it's probably a origin story or an ideological story describing how language developed. And so we all scatter with our many different languages. Here's he makes reference to the idea that other people had flood stories. I said, please watch my videos that outline the biblical material. The themes in terms of the chapters 12 to 50 really hearken about that promise, that covenantal promise. Now, the three parts of the covenant that I will get to in Genesis 12 are the promised land, which will eventually be Israel, It's called Canaan. That's the geographical designation, and it's the coastal area that is now Israel. It's called Canaan, kind of like this is North America, and then the country will be Israel, kind of like United States is the country, right? So, so Canaan is the country, the promised land. Many descendants is part two of that covenant with Abraham and his descendants. You will have many descendants, which will eventually result in the 12 tribes of Israel. And then that God will be your God forever. So God is committed in this contract to be with us forever. In return, because there's always two parts to a contract, we have to obey his commandments. So at the bottom line, this biblical world and these biblical people are in a conditional relationship with God. We have to obey God's commandments in order to get those three things of the covenant: promised land, many descendants, and God will be your God forever. Remember those three things of the covenant, okay? So this promise, this never-ending promise of descendants and land, is that central theme of that journey. Abraham and Sarah are semi-nomadic peoples that kind of traverse back and forth between Canaan and Egypt. And they do this because of that covenant, because God promised them that covenant. Continuing into Isaac and Rebekah, Abraham's son Isaac and his wife Rebekah, they are also semi-nomadic sheep herders that migrate back and forth. And then by the time we go to the stories of Jacob and his wife Rachel and Leah, and then Joseph, and he doesn't have a wife, but those generations, they are semi-sedentary farmers. So that's why he says the story of Jacob serves to kind of balance the Abraham narrative and pave the way for Jacob's son Joseph. So make sure you read that Hauer chapter about the patriarchs. Even though we only read Genesis 12, which is kind of the kickoff chapter for the patriarchs, just make sure that you are familiar with that journey. Okay? All right. Joseph's stories, he talks about that briefly, and then the Genesis ends with that promise, that covenantal promise to Abraham renewed, but just not fulfilled. So if you look at this table of dates as to when these things, this is kind of like the historical context of Genesis. Okay. So let's take a look at Genesis 12 then, because I want to make sure that you have an understanding. Now, Genesis 12 is, Genesis 1 through 11 is primeval history. Genesis 12 to 50 is basically a series of story cycles about the four different patriarchs. Abraham, which is 12 to 26. Isaac, who only gets two stories, probably because whoever edited his material didn't get in. Then 28 through, I believe, 40 is Jacob, and then 40 to 50 is Joseph. So it's kind of four separate story cycles, with Isaac just being in a very tiny one. Now, I have you read this chapter because the Lord basically, in the beginning of these four patriarchs, meaning male leaders of a family line, essentially picks one family. Before this point, he had dealt with all of humanity, but now he's saying, okay, just the line of Abraham, go from your country and your kindred. I'm going to take you to the promised land. So Abraham and his descendants actually were from Babylon, that whole area, which is kind of near Iraq. Okay, so I'm going to bring you, and if you trust me, I will make of you to the land I will show you, promised land. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, meaning many descendants, and I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse, and all of your families of the earth shall be blessed. I will be your God. So that's when he introduces that covenantal promise of those three things. So Abraham goes and basically follows God, right? The key thing here in terms of Abraham's story, and also his son Isaac, the third patriarch Jacob, and the fourth patriarch Joseph, is that all of them are flawed, just like the people from Genesis 1 through 11. That's why it's important to see the second part of the story, where Abraham kind of lies and is scared and endangers his life in Egypt. So pay attention to that. Even though these patriarchs are amazing, even though they're in covenantal promises with God, they are also flawed. They also break the covenant. And despite that, God stays with his people. But sometimes there are periods of trial and tribulation, which is the period right before the Exodus. So we'll go over that next.